Okay, hello and welcome everyone to our second panel. I'm Attiya Ahmad and I'm an anthropologist who's based here at GWU. First, I wanted to thank the folks who are involved with organizing and ensuring that this conference takes place. So my fellow co-organizers, Mika Natif and Joel Fletcher, as well as Mona Attiya and Shana Marshall, the director and associate directors of the Institute of Middle East Studies, who both ensured that today's event could happen. And of course to Christian, our multitasking, all-purpose colleague who makes this happen as smoothly as possible. So thank you all. The underlying idea of the second panel was to explore how textile production, textile circulation and trade, textile consumption, including but not limited to its use as furnishings and sartorial performances, and textile preservation, for example, museum practices, are integral to the production of interrelated spatial ontologies, including domestic, ethno-national, and interregional spaces. Before turning to our speakers, a few quick housekeeping notes. Each presenter will have 15 minutes to present, and I will put up this paper at different intervals to give you a sense of how much time you have left, either 5 minutes or time is up. After the three presentations, I will make some brief comments and pose a few general questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from our audience online, as well as to those who are here in person. We are fortunate to have with us today three excellent presenters connected to that, that explore some of the themes I mentioned. We will start today with Professor Richard Bulliet, and then we'll hear from Professor Nader Sayadi, and then Professor Patricia Blessing will join us online. I will introduce each of the speakers just before they present. Okay, so I'll start with Professor Bulliet, who is Professor Emeritus of Columbia University, who specializes in Middle Eastern history, the social and institutional history of Islamic countries, and the history of technology. So over to you, Professor Bulliet.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to solve all the technical visual problems by not having any PowerPoint. But it does mean the downside is you'll have to look at me, I guess, if you're following this. I come to textile history at the end of a very long road that began over 50 years ago when I decided to embark on doctoral study of the history of the city of Nishapur in northeastern Iran in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. I was given access at that time to 3 unpublished manuscripts of local biographical dictionaries for the city of Nishapur, courtesy of the late Professor Richard N. Fry. And I decided to approach these biographical dictionaries in what was then a unusual way, that is to say, quantitatively. For this, I used a manual coding system, Royal McBee key sort cards, not computers. Computers at that time would have been extremely clumsy to use and soon outdated, either in the software or the hardware. I can still use the cards I made then, thousands of them, today to extract data. So the data that I've extracted has differed as the decades went by, as I've had new questions asked and have gone back to my cards to find out what I could on the question at hand. But one thing that was apparent almost from the start and has been confirmed lately by other quantitative researchers, much more up to date in their technologies, like Maxim Romanov, is that the incidence of Iranian religious scholars leaving some sort of mark where we have their names is vastly higher than any other part of the Muslim world in that period of time, with the matching level from Iraq. But Iraq, as the place where Kufa, Basra, and Baghdad provide major metropolitan centers, and particularly early on major military centers for the caliphate. Iran did not have, in the interior of Iran, any major military centers. It guarded the frontiers at places like Merv, Gorgan, Balkh, Derbent, but in the Iranian plateau area, where the great cities like Nishapur and Isfahan and Ray, Shiraz and Fars province, you didn't have a large Arab garrison. And yet the incidence of these religious scholars is all predicated upon the fact that they were working in the Arabic language. And yet they don't appear necessarily to have been Arabs. So we're dealing with an enormous amount of religious presence by people who are not working in their actual vernacular language. Why was Iran the most productive region? And that it could be a fluke of preservation, but I don't think so. I think that in fact, Iran was the most productive region in terms of Islamic religious text production, study, etc. I don't think there's much question about that. All 6 of the compilers of the canonical collections of hadith come from Iran, and I don't think that's a coincidence. So it implied that you had a large number of people who had the leisure and the means to master Arabic, which, at least from my point of view as a student in America, is not an easy task and takes many more years than you ever thought it was going to take. And even then, you're nowhere near mastery. It's tragic. But these are people who did that. They also are people who were collecting hadith. That is to say, they were traveling often for months or years on end to find statements attributed to the Prophet Muhammad or members of his immediate family and entourage relating to religious lore outside of the context of the Quran, but often elaborating upon verses in the Quran. The number of hadith that were collected that at some point were in circulation in Iran would appear to be several hundred thousand. Ultimately, a few tens of thousands were collected and considered to be canonical, that is to say, considered to be more reliable than the others, reliable in the sense that thought to have been the most likely to have actually come from Muhammad. And at that point, you had a winnowing where this large corpus was turned into a much smaller corpus, which actually had, I mean, from a general Muslim point of view, this is very positive development because it produces a commonly accepted corpus of non-Quranic but religiously important materials that everyone can rely on. On the other hand, at the time in Iran, when these big collections are beginning the process of becoming canonical, it's a destructive process, because when you are in a given community and you have heard, collected, gone to class, heard the sheikh recite these hadith with their isnads, and you wrote them down, or your uncle or your father wrote them down, or you just heard them, you did not at that moment say, well, I think that one's fake, and I think that one's good. You were not making that selection. You accepted them all. So that when the winnowing occurred, the local collection of what was considered to be religiously important lore regarding the prophet was discredited. in many communities. We don't, because the collections of hadith are not organized to recover geography. It would be interesting to find out whether there are certain places that yielded a higher number of reliable hadith than other places. That would be an internal religious geography of Iran, which nobody has undertaken, but it might be done. The reason I got to textiles is because in my search for the source of all these people, I looked at the occupational epithets that they had. Originally, this work was done by Chaim Cohen back in the early 60s. He wrote an article which he never followed up on. And in the article, he found that of the large, probably 10,000 biographical entries that he looked at, he found the largest occupational area was textiles. And that included the people who dealt in the textiles or in the production of the fiber, and people who tailored textiles or sold them secondhand or something like that. In other words, he had these occupational epithets that were attached as names, not yet surnames, but we don't know precisely how often a person bearing a name like cotton grower, Qattan, actually grew cotton, or whether that's what his daddy did or someone else. Nevertheless, it was the most important economic segment of the early Muslim economy with regard to people who are in the religious elite who have the leisure and the inspiration to engage in collecting the hadith of the Prophet. When I looked at the biographical dictionaries of Nishapur, Isfahan, and Gorgan, 3 cities in Iran, I found that the percentage of people who were dealing in textiles was much higher, and they're dealing almost exclusively in cotton textiles. So that the 3 most important names were Qattan, meaning someone who's growing cotton, Bezzaz, which is a sort of common sheeting sort of material made of cotton, and Karabisi, which comes in later. That's more an 11th century term, and that seems to come from a Sanskrit original. It is often described as being a heavier, maybe canvas-like textile, and yet there's no agreement on that. It's rare outside of Khorasan, but it becomes quite common in the East. When you put those 3 together, it ended up that they were 40% of all the occupational epithets. The next epithet down from those 3, from that cluster rather of cotton-involved personalities, was Tajir, meaning merchant. So you didn't have a clear-cut second choice. Cotton dominated the Iranian religious elite. It was a civilian religious elite. These are not people in the army or working for a court. What I did in a book called Cotton, Climate, and Camels in Early Islamic Iran was explain that the reason for this is because cotton, which was not grown on the Iranian plateau prior to the Islamic conquest, becomes a new form of exploiting the land, dependent upon local irrigation systems by Qanat, and that this was an enterprise that Muslims, whether Arabs or converts to Islam, engaged in, partly because if you could irrigate desert land in Iran, according to Islamic law, you could become the owner of that land. And therefore, you did not have to somehow insert yourself into a pre-existing Iranian rainfall-based economy. You could basically create your own economy if you had the means to do so, which was a fairly expensive process. And yet it appears that thousands of new farming villages came into being producing cotton. And importantly, the indications we have from bits and pieces of tax lore is that cotton was taxed at about double the rate of wheat and barley. So that clearly it was a lucrative trade. I argue that this was related to an effort of Muslims to look different from the people whose sartorial styles went back to the Sassanid period, and that it led to people wearing large expanses of cotton cloth as gowns, robes, cloaks, headdress, and that they looked like Muslims. This partly had to do with the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad that they collected, which said that Muslims should not wear silk in this world. That is for them in the next world. Or some that say a Muslim should not wear silk except for 3 fingers, because that represented the tiraz, embroidery that you had on plain fabric. And that plain white fabric with tiraz embroidery, I believe, is the analog of Islamic Nishapur ware ceramics, where you have a white plate with very elaborate black or aubergine calligraphy around the edges. The boom in cotton, I believe, died in the 11th century. I think it was because of the climate change. Other people have argued that it's because Turks decided to invade the Middle East. I think the Turks decided to come to the Middle East because of climate change. So we're not going to get any soon agreement on that issue. But we do have an agreement, you see it in the geographers, that cotton stops being produced in northern Iran. And then it restarts a couple of centuries later. And in modern times, northern Iran has become a major source of cotton. When I went there to Nishapur in 1966, the only other Westerner residing in the city at the time that I was there was a French cotton expert who was advising on the local cotton crop. So just like Uzbekistan, this became a big crop in the modern period. So my conclusion was that you had a class of civilian, Muslim, wealthy merchant cotton growers and dealers who created an industry that supported the growth of huge cities like Nishapur and Ray, and supported an enormous increase in Iranian trade, because Iran never before had had a major export product. It had a transit product from the Silk Road, but not a major export product. And particularly they were supplying cotton to Iraq, which did not grow its own cotton because of the unruly regimes of the Tigris and Euphrates River that would flood in the spring, so that you did not have an appropriate irrigation source. I put the text of my paper on academia.edu a couple of weeks ago to make it available for people to read the text and comment on it if they wish. I'd be grateful for any comments anyone might want to write in there. The only question raised since then, somebody said, well, they had qanats in Oman, they had cotton in Yemen, maybe all this happened in Southern Arabia, but without anything more, we can't go far with that. And I'd be grateful for anyone who knows where there are either any surviving textiles or pictures of textiles from Iran prior to the year 1000. Thank you.
Next, we have Professor Nader Sayadi, who is an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who also has an educational and professional background in architectural history, historic preservation, and architectural design. His current research interest is the bilateral relationship between the goods production networks and craft landscapes, the Pax Mongolica, to the dawn of the modern industrial area in the Middle East and Central Asia.
Today, I would like to present part of my first book manuscript project, which discusses the mass production of silk fabrics in the city of Kashan in central Iran from the mid-18th to the mid-19th centuries. In this project, I'm particularly interested in exploring alternative approaches to writing architectural, urban, and textile histories when textile sources are scarce. This project concentrates on an interrelated group of mundane objects and buildings, particularly the architectural and spatial aspects of a group of silk weaving workshops in Kashan, to write an economic and social history of the city's textile production. It also relies on historical accounts to reconstruct the social networks of urban elites and ethnographic data to illustrate the silk production craft networks to support the project's interpretations and arguments. The central argument of this book project is that the local elites of Kashan invested in the mass production of plain silk fabrics as part of a citywide economic and urban development after an earthquake in the second half of the 18th century. Kashan is an industrial city located midway between Isfahan and Tehran, former and current capital cities of Iran, respectively, in the central Iranian plateau. The city experienced a catastrophic event in the second half of the 18th century. A large portion of Kashan was destroyed in the last major earthquake in the region in 1778. However, Kashan revived relatively quick. In only a decade, the bazaar of the city was full of merchants, while the local elites were investing in the redevelopment of the city by building public and private structures across Kashan. At the heart of this endeavor was the construction of a group of silk weaving workshops to mass produce plain silks. Several of these structures are still standing. Locally called the Sharbafi workshops, these buildings are humble structures with no significant architectural embellishments or inscriptions. Besides brief mentions of the silk industries in Kashan in textual sources between the 15th and 17th centuries, these workshops are neither associated with known patrons nor commonly represented in written sources, written histories. Nevertheless, many of these Sharbafi workshops appear to have long histories and remain active today in Kashan, where master artisans, many of them in their 60s or older, continue to weave simple silk fabrics on hand looms. These structures share identical architectural and spatial features. Like most of the structures in the history district of Kashan, the Sharbafi workshops were designed in a way that the floor is below the street level. All the workshops floors are approximately 2 to 4 meters below the ground. As a peculiar spatial characteristic, these workshops are one-story buildings. The ceilings stand about 3 to 5 meters above the street level on a grid of piers with no interior partition walls. This spatial composition results in identical hypostyle hall like Shabastans, approximately halfway buried in the ground with 6 to 8 meters tall ceilings. More significantly, these workshops share a specific spatial characteristic. Their spatial layouts consist of a multiplication of a spatial unit, which this study calls the Sharbafi module. The primary defining feature of this module is the Sharbafi loom. One loom occupies the entire space of each bay, or put differently, each bay is built around a loom. The two ends of the Sharbafi loom are fixed into and held by the structure of the workshop, because the looms are built directly into each bay's two piers, while the side beams and corner posts of the looms, often most extended and structurally vital members of wooden hand looms, are omitted by design. As a result, the horizontal cross beams of the loom at its two ends transmit the total weight of the loom parts, and the threads installed on them to the workshop's piers instead of directly to the ground. Therefore, the building's mud brick piers simultaneously hold the arches and vaulting system above them and act as the Shabbafi loom's frame, since the loom can't stand alone. In other words, craft and spatial form are merged to create an industrial architecture that embodies and generates the industry it also shelters. The looms and architecture become one. This modular design reveals a strategy for the mass production of space. The Shabbafi module allowed the builders to efficiently construct several workshops in urban lots of various shapes by fitting as many units in each urban lot as possible. The strategy of omitting the longest and strongest wooden member parts of the loom resulted in reducing the amount of required timber in an area like the Kashan region, that such materials were scarce and expensive. Therefore, this specific loom design significantly reduced the costs of construction and equipment of the workshops, mainly when tens, if not hundreds of them were built as one urban project in a relatively short period. These spatial and architectural specifications of the Shabbafi workshops in Kashan show a deliberate process of standardization behind the workshop's conceptualization in order to mass produce workspaces and efficiently build multiple workshops to maximize profit. The mass production of fabrics is also evident in the technical characteristics of the Shabbafi loom type. This loom is a type of pit loom, which is also a shaft loom, with a hybrid tensile system. On the weaver side, it is a horizontal loom. The woven fabric is collected around a cloth beam, while the weaver operates the foot threadles installed in a pit beneath the weaver. On the other end, the Shabbafi loom operates like a vertical loom, as the gravity maintains the warp's tension, since the end of the warps are bundled around rods called Galan Back in Persian, attached to weights. In these looms, small sacks full of sand, and hung from a warp end spool rack. The transition between the horizontal and vertical tensile system is achieved by using a deflection bar called farak, which is a simple but crucial device. The Shabbafi loom has 4 shafts. Therefore, it is only capable of producing either plain or twill fabrics, technically not satin anymore, which needs at least 5. It also lacks a second harness system, which controls complex patterns in draw looms. That's the reason why I call it shaft loom, not a draw loom. As a result, Shabbafi looms are not capable of weaving complex fabrics such as lampes, textiles common in Safavid Iran. The main advantage of the Shabbafi loom is its ability to weave wide fabrics. The width of the reed roughly measures 70 inches or 180 centimeters. The length of warp is approximately 18 feet or 5.5 meters. Although the fabric woven on these looms could be used as either sashes, clogs, covers for bedding and furniture, or even parts of tents, a considerable yardage of those fabrics were perhaps cut and tailored as part of garments such as shirts and pants, which often don't need to be wider than 22 inches or 60 centimeters. In other words, the Shabbafi loom seems to be unnecessarily wide. Therefore, this study argues that the physical dimensions of the Shabbafi looms formed another strategy to facilitate the production of high quantities of fabrics in shorter time. The mass production of silk fabrics in Kashan is also evident in the multitude of workshops. This study mapped 44 Shabbafi workshops across Kashan's historic urban fabric. These buildings are in various conditions, from still producing silk fabrics in total capacity to standing abandoned or in ruins. Although various in size, they share similar architectural and structural features, and all are built based on the Shabbafi module. A rough estimation suggests that present-day Kashan hosts approximately 167 looms in 44 workshops. And I mentioned estimation because I haven't been able to finish my field work because I prefer not, because of the political situation and my immigration status, I prefer not to leave the country. So this is like a part of like what I want to continue. I technically did 9 of 44. So it's a long way to go. I need to go back and really finish it, but I've visited all of them. I haven't documented all of them. The 44 Shabafi workshops identified in this study survive as vestige of a more extensive network of silk fabric production in Kashan. A detailed document composed in 1878-79 or 1296 Hijri for the governor of Qom at the time reports that Kashan had 448 Shabafi looms. The quantitative data concerning Shabafi workshops in Kashan reveals that their number constantly declined between the 1870s and 2020s. The data addressing the workshops before this period have yet to surface. The presence of the Shabafi craft in Kashan indicates that a wide range of crafts associated with silk weaving existed in the city, its hinterland and beyond as well. The extent and complexity of the Shabafi network in Kashan shows that Shabafi workshops were an integral part of a larger urban phenomenon in Kashan. A variety of locations in Kashan and its hinterland embodied the nodes and links of this network. Many are distinctive architectural types specialized in and concentrated on fulfilling one stage of the production. The Shabafi crafts network indicates the existence of a group of interrelated places across the city, some of which are now lost. It is important to note that each node in this network represents multiple workshops practicing similar crafts and several artisans. In this sense, numerous place types, each of them multiplied in their dozens, if not hundreds, pursue the shared goal of producing finished silk fabrics in Kashan. In sum, the spatial module or standardization, loom size or volume or yardage, the number of workshops, large workforce, and the craft network division of labor suggests that a mass production of silk was going on in this period. Further contextualization of the Shabafi workshops also suggests that they were indeed part of a larger urban reconstruction after the earthquake of 1778 in Kashan. Historical sources reveal that despite this catastrophic destruction, Kashan managed to revive quickly. Although still recovering from the earthquake, Kashan was already a thriving city with artisans and merchants at work only 18 years later. Olivier, who visited Kashan in October 1796, described the city as beautiful, prosperous, and expansive with mosques, caravanserais, and the royal palace in good condition. He estimated, however, that 1/5 of the houses were still in ruins. The urban development continued well into the first half of the 19th century. Several charitable infrastructural projects such as cisterns, qanats, and hammams were built to enhance people's everyday life. Mosques and madrasas of various sizes dotted Kashan, the city of the faithful, as it is called, the title of the city Darul Mu'minin, during the 19th century. Newly built or restored caravanserais and timches created more spaces for trade and commerce in the bazaar, and many houses were built for the rich and the poor. Indeed, this robust urban redevelopment changed the city's face. Besides a few pre-18th century monuments that survived the earthquake, Kashan's built environment was likely almost entirely reconstructed. Local histories of Kashan, such as Mirat al-Ghassan or Tarikh al-Kashan, written in 1870s, demonstrate that Kashan's local elite led citywide urban development concurrent with the construction of the Shabafi workshops in the second half of the 18th and the first half of the 19th centuries. These local notable individuals and households invested in robust construction endeavors that transformed the face of the city, which resulted in a construction boom in this period. This study contributes to the recent scholarship that argued for the mass production of goods in the Islamic world before the adaptation of the new technologies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The spatiality and materiality of Shabafi workshops provide us with information concerning mass production in pre-industrial Kashan that have not been surfaced in textual sources yet. A study of the interrelated global markets and the various dimensions of consumption and production, not fully discussed in this presentation, also reveal that how silk weaving in Shafiq workshops in Kashan came back to life after a severe earthquake, and how they went out of fashion during a phenomenon I call the wool turn in 19th century Iran, which is actually a part of what I'm doing as a postdoc at the Met on Kashmiri shawls. This research examines the centrality of Europe in global history in the age of commercialization and industrialization, revealing evidence for the mass production of both architecture and textiles in an urban center in Iran. Thank you.
So our third and last presenter for this panel is Professor Patricia Blessing, who is an assistant professor of art and archaeology at Princeton University. Professor Blessing specializes in the art and architecture of the Islamic world, with a focus on the Eastern Mediterranean from the 12th to the 15th centuries.
Now, what I'm going to present to you today is part of a larger project that I'm currently working on, which addresses the relationship between objects, design, and interior spaces in the Islamic architecture of Anatolia from the late 12th to the late 15th centuries. Here, I'm interested in larger issues that I will eventually address in the resulting book that are related to interior design and planning, multisensory perception of space and of objects. But I'm also here, of course, interested in the central role that textile take in these interior spaces, as in many contexts in medieval and early modern contexts around the globe, as we've seen in the studies of scholars such as Galan Back or Tristan Weddingen, and also in the wonderful catalog Woven Interiors Furnishing Early Medieval Egypt that Gudrun Buhl, Sumru Belger-Crody, and Elizabeth Doswell Williams wrote and edited. Now, today, most of monuments that survive from the period that I'm interested in do not retain their original interior furnishings. Visitors and users of these buildings nowadays are faced with interiors that are fundamentally different from what they looked like in the Middle Ages or at any other point in these buildings' history before the late 19th or early 20th centuries. Mosques and mausolea generally retain their original function, but carpets and other furnishings have been replaced over the centuries and today mostly consist of modern items. Other buildings such as madrasas and domestic spaces, if they survive, have been turned over to new functions, serving as museums, stores, or art centers. The movable objects such as chandeliers and bookstands, carpets and censers are often found in museums, either because they were stolen and sold on the art market as collectors' interest in Islamic art increased beginning in the late 19th century, or because they were removed for safekeeping to prevent such theft. The mihrab of the mid-13th century Beyheki Mosque in Konya, for instance, is now in the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin, very derived by way of the art market in 1908. And I should add, I also consider tiles to some extent as furnishings, because they're sort of, there's something going on, I mean, sort of on the edge between interior decoration and furnishing, but they're certainly, because in Anatolia, they're almost exclusively used in interior spaces rather than on facades like in Iran or Central Asia. To my sense, they belong to the interior design of the monuments, which is one part of the larger question of my project. Other objects, such as the one you see on the screen, the doors of the Great Mosque of Jizre were taken, were removed later. The remaining door knocker and the doors were taken to the Türk ve İslam Eserleri Müzesi in Istanbul in the 1970s, after the other door knockers have been stolen. That's the one you see on the right, which happens to be in a prominent museum collection. Now, the project really aims at reconstructing the interiors of several buildings based on museum archives in Turkey that maintain records of objects and which list, to some extent, which monuments objects come from. These are dispersed over a number of different collections. The Türk ve İslam Eserleri Müzesi in Istanbul is one. And there's others. I'll be doing the field work for that project next year during my sabbatical, since I just got the research permit to actually access these archives. Now, I want to show you some case studies of what buildings look like today and what we can figure out in terms of objects that may belong to them so far. Now, bear in mind, this is without having done the actual archival research. So this is really, to some extent, impressionistic and also very preliminary, but it will give you a sense of what we know. And some of this will be textiles, some of it won't. So here, the first example is the so-called Alaeddin Mosque in Konya. Now, when you go inside nowadays, and this is a functioning mosque, what you see is, and of course, you can see modern wall-to-wall carpet. That's what you will get. In general, in mosques in Turkey today. There's a chandelier here that's certainly not medieval. Things such as candlesticks or candle holders that would have been placed next to the mihrab, just about where that lovely plug-in ventilator is located, are also no longer in the space. And so you're faced with a space that is functional but doesn't contain much of the historical objects, certainly not carpets. Now, I'm not saying historical carpets should still be in these mosques, certainly not, right? They should be preserved in museums, as some of them are. Here, I'm just showing you a view across a room in the Türk ve İslam Eserleri Müzesi, because they do have in that collection some carpets from medieval Anatolia. There's one here in the back, and here you can see a little better how these are displayed in a museum today. Now, they are displayed here without the context of the buildings they belong to. And the labels don't tell us whether or not it's known which buildings these came from, actually, and I'm hoping the archives will tell me. Nonetheless, these would be the kinds of carpets from, from, for instance, the 13th century that are contemporary to the mosque I just showed you and could have been in that space at some point in its history. This is one other example, which is of course fragmentary, as you can see, and here is another one that survives in damaged form, but that, in a way that gives us roughly its shape and dimensions. Now, the challenge is to sort of think about layers of objects in time, right? So these carpets here, they were preserved in mosques until the late 19th or early 20th century. Were they supplemented by later carpets? Certainly. There are, for instance, also in the Vakıflar Carpet Museum in Istanbul, 16th century and 17th century, so Ottoman period carpets that were taken from the 13th century Great Mosque of Divriği near Sivas, and that happened in that 13th century space. And then there's any number of objects sort of over this long history of these buildings that could have been in there. And so one of the questions that I'm asking and I'm posing myself is also, well, which point in time do I try to get back to, and can I even get back to something close to what a 13th century mosque interior could have looked like, right? If I strip away all the objects that are later, if I can find enough, what do I get to? Now, one structure where we can sort of pursue this question a little more closely is the mausoleum of Jalaluddin Rumi and the Mevlevi shrine of Konya. Why? Well, the site was turned into a museum in the late 1920s, shortly after the Sufi shrines across Turkey were shut down in 1925. So what you get is something that's frozen in time and museumified. Essentially, you have whatever was in there in 1925 still there and now cataloged as part of a museum collection. What you can see in the image on the left, the interior and with a view of actually the cenotaph over the tomb of Mevlana, that's covered in 19th century textiles. So you already have the late layer. What's underneath is this, the 13th century carved cenotaphs, which again, that's furnishings too, right? If you think about the wooden semi-movable objects that you have in spaces like also minbars, these kind of cenotaphs that exist in several mausolea in Anatolia, although most of them are no longer in situ. These ones here are, and such objects. You can also find, and then here you have these hanging lamps, right, that are also, I mean, I don't know right now what these period these are, but I'll figure it out eventually. You also have it in a collection and objects such as this book stands from the 13th century, hanging censer, and maybe the most famous ones, the so-called Nisantase, which is an ilkhanid inlaid metal object that was given to the shrine in the 14th century. And then on top of it, you have all these later objects. Here, and for the purposes of the workshop, right there, I didn't show you any medieval textiles. And that's one of the things I have to actually go and look, just because what's published from the shrine, the textiles are all 19th century. It doesn't mean there aren't other things in the collection. Now, as a third example, that's from the 15th century, I want to show you sort of a glimpse into other sources beyond museum records. The mosque Zavia complex of Ottoman Sultan Mehmed I in Bursa is an interesting case where essentially what happens is, well, I'll stay here for a minute. So you have the main building, which is founded as a mosque Zavia that's in the Ottoman context, a multifunctional building where you have a section, this section here, where the mihrab is, that serves as a mosque. But then you have side rooms that serve for all kinds of other functions. Some of them serve for lodgings, some of them for Sufi rituals. So it's this kind of multifunctional structure. There's literally hundreds of these being built in the 14th and 15th century Ottoman Empire. In the 16th century, Ottoman priorities shift, and a lot of these buildings in the second quarter of the 16th century are turned into Friday mosques. And the ones that are turned into Friday mosques at that point in time today still are by and large Friday mosques. So you have this sort of early period where there's something else and we don't quite know what this looks like. And then you have what you get today. And so today you get what you have on the left, where the entire interior is treated as the prayer hall of the mosque, hence it's covered in carpets. But originally, essentially this up here would have been the mosque. Now, what you see on the right is from Albert Gabriel's 1958 publication, where, as you can see, older carpets are still in place. Are these 15th century? No. But 16th or 17th, perhaps, yes. So again, open question. Can we figure out where these carpets now are today? And sort of what kinds of things were in place until what period? And another aspect of this building is so that this question of what was covered in carpets, right? Now, with the assumption that these became Friday mosques in the 16th century, I at first thought, okay, fine, then they've been all carpeted ever since. There's 2 points, or 2 reasons why I'm not entirely sure anymore. One is this 19th century print from Léon Parvier's publication of Ottoman architecture in Bursa. Parvier is the person who restores much of the tile work of the Ottoman buildings of Bursa after the 1855 earthquake. And we restore in the sense that a lot of it's actually completely redone. The fact that Viollet-le-Duc writes a preface to the book tells you the kind of approach to architecture and its preservation is taken here. But what's interesting here is that actually Parvier shows the courtyard uncovered. He also shows, by the way, all these lovely candlesticks, which again would be something to chase down. So again, did this look like this in the mid-19th century, or is this, to what extent is this kind of a realistic representation of what was going on? One clue, perhaps, is the fountain. Now, the fountain is in the middle of that central section, and it kind of suggests that this might really have been treated like a courtyard. Also because you also have other buildings from the 13th to 15th century where there is some sort of water feature in courtyards. Here, I was never sure, actually, looking at the current fountain, which is, I don't think it's 15th century, it's probably 19th century, but I was always wondering, was this just added at that point, or was there something earlier? Now, Chidem Kafestioglu actually, in a study that talks about this transformation of mosque zavias into Friday mosques in the Ottoman 16th century, found a court record dated 1552 that includes a request for the fountain to be removed from the building because the overflow from it threatened to flood what was now considered part of the prayer hall. So that courtyard, which was now no longer a courtyard. The fountain remained, right? But there's just something, there's something was going on, sort of turning the space into part of the prayer hall, maybe putting carpets there, but then maybe not because you're worried about them getting wet and ruined. So there's sort of these kind of sources that can show up and tell us something about where textiles were placed, where other objects are placed, and how spaces were treated within interiors. And as a last type of source, there are also waqf documents, which can do two different things. They can either talk about specific people who are appointed as staff to take care of categories of objects. So for instance, in the Waqfiyya for the Yurguch Pasha Mosque Zavia in Amasya, which is dated 1436, there's sort of the usual kind of staff you'd expect, the Sheikh, Imam, and so on and so forth. But there's also one person appointed to take care of, specifically of lamps and carpets. So ensuring the maintenance, ensuring the cleaning of these kinds of objects, which sort of places, sort of highlights how important these objects were. And then there's additional endowments of either objects, often books, but could be other things as well, or for instance, lamp oil to be used in the lighting of the buildings, which again, sort of point to the presence of XYZ objects. Now, this is of course all very preliminary still, and I think there's just a lot to be said about what kinds of textiles eventually I will be able to trace, and whether or not we'll be able to tell a little more of how these interior spaces looked and how we can sort of understand them better than as sort of these denuded spaces that are today. This is the mausoleum that belongs to the same mosque complex, which now is sort of semi-museumified. You still have, it's sort of no longer has any textiles in it, but it's still a burial site. But I'll leave you with this then, early or mid-19th century view of it. We actually have a really striking presence of textiles here probably by the look of these, they could be 16th, 17th, 18th century and later, but within the space, along with this absolutely lovely hanging device with lamps and these sort of ostrich eggs. So it's kind of the objects related to these types of interiors, effectively, that I'm going to try to trace. And I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you three for these wonderful papers, all of which in different ways address the questions of the interrelation of textiles and the production of space. In Bulliet's paper, we learn about the confluence of factors, including cash-rich Arab settlers, restrictions by caliphal authorities on displacing and evicting non-Arab landholders, homesteading provisions of Islamic law, and usufruct rights to lands previously regarded as barren, the Qanat system, Yemeni, perhaps Omani, you mentioned, learned cotton production know-how, Bonnet profit-sharing agreements, through which cotton and cotton textiles come to be produced and a market for them developed in the central Iranian plateau, and how this marks the increasing integration of Muslim Arabs and Islam into the region, making it a distinctive space within the broader Muslim world, marked by the influence of a new civilian merchant religious elite, as you know, whose development and achievements, including fi talab al-ilm and hadith collections developed through this, new Muslim institutions that you mentioned in your paper, such as madrasas and Sufi convents, would spread to and shape other Muslim spaces and heartlands. More succinctly put, we learn about cotton production as integral to the emergence of new and distinctive Muslim spaces and how this leads to the reshaping of pre-existing Muslim spaces. Sayadi examines how the development of mass-produced plain silks and kashan from the mid-18th to the mid-19th century not only constituted a vital means of rebuilding and revitalizing the city in the aftermath of a devastating earthquake, but how its development, particularly in the form of sharbafi, pardon my pronunciation, sharbafi, workshops, mark the merging of craft and spatial form, where loom and architecture become one, and creates an industrial architecture that embodies and generates the industry it also shelters. Lovely phrasing and conceptualizations here. A discussion that ultimately pushes us to interrogate how we center Europe in global history in the age of commercialization and industrialization. And finally, Blessing's project, that in contrast to the other two, pushes us to consider processes of consumption and use, and how the use and sometimes persistence, but more so it seems, perhaps the replacement of furnishings, including textiles, and their vital interrelationship to the production of interior spaces in the Islamic architecture of Anatolia from the late 12th to the late 15th century, a project that contributes to our understanding of phenomenology and sensory archaeology and a multisensory perception of space, resonant with the work of, for example, Becerra Pincheva, among others. So these are rich papers that leave us with much to consider about the interrelation again of textiles and space. So I have two sets of very general questions, more to provoke discussion, I hope, hopefully not to shut it down, as one always worries about when posing questions, perhaps. Okay, so the first question. Playing with what I'll heuristically demarcate in terms of production and consumption, I would invite Richard and Nader to share insights or reflect, if they can, on, like, based on the sources available, on the consumption and or circulation and trade of cotton and plain silks, in addition to production. And also invite Patricia to share insights or reflect on where some of these textile furnishings you mentioned or you hope to examine in further work and research that you hope to conduct were produced. So thinking about the flip side in terms of the focus on consumption and production. And then the second question is sort of multi-layered. So one, had you sought to focus on textiles? Yes, no. And I would invite you to share your thoughts on whether you think research on textiles have been overlooked and ignored in broader Middle East studies, both as a focus of study, but also as a potential alternative archive. And has the shift to a focus on questions of embodiment and object theory shifted perhaps our appreciation of the potential and possibilities of examining textiles? And if textiles have indeed been given short thrift, based on your experiences, why might this be the case? And how can it potentially enrich our understanding of the field? And what goes unexamined through its elisions? So,
Those are 2 questions.
yeah, as I said, a kind of multi-layered second set of questions, just to sort of invite some reflection maybe on textiles in terms of a site and means of knowledge production in the field of Middle East studies. I wish I had typed it out to hand out. So thank you again.
I'll make a couple of comments.
Okay.
I only dealt with cotton, but you also mentioned cotton and silk. Silk was produced in Iran. And in the 10th century, you had people with occupational epithets like Hariri and Ibrisani, but they fade out. And like Lebad for felt dealers. Early on, you have that, and you also have Ferra for fur dealers. But the felt and the fur, which I take to be Central Asian imports, are only in the earliest layers. The silk lasts a little bit longer, but the problem is that in Iran, silk takes a great deal of water, both for the mulberry trees, for the processing of the silk. The lack of perennial water sources in abundance in the interior before you had qanats, I think meant that silk was confined to the northern province around the Elbrus Mountains, Mazandaran, and Gorgan at the southern corner of the Caspian Sea. And this is where, in the Safavid period, you have a lot of silk coming back. But I assume in Kashan, they were using qanats, because Kashan is a great deal of qanat irrigation. In the broad sense that you were talking about, the importance of textiles, I think that there has been so much of a focus in Islamic cultural history on elite production, and particularly when it comes to objects, on elite consumption around courts and so forth. This is what gets preserved in museums very often, that the role of sort of everyday fabrics has been almost expunged from the historical narrative. But for the period I'm dealing with, to me, the growth of the Iranian cotton industry on the central Iranian plateau made Iran the center of Islam in a way that people have been reluctant to realize. Of course, people disagree with me, that's fine. But I think that we need to have more of an understanding of where people got their textiles and how they use them. And the rise of kerbas in the 11th century, I have a hunch that this may relate to the coming of the Turks and the building of pavilions for military establishments that moved around with the Sultanate. The early Arabs, of course, used wool for black tents that were rather low and extensive, but the pavilions that arise in the Turco-Timurid Mongol arena may have called for a heavier sort of fabric, and it may be that that's what the rise of kerbas signifies. I've noted that I know of only 2 people in the biographical materials I'm aware of with the name Khayyam, meaning tent maker. One of them was a scholar from who is simply known as Khayyam, mentioned in Sarani. The other one is Omar Khayyam. But because building a tent is a pedestrian activity, I have a feeling that the Khayyam is not tent maker, but rather pavilion purveyor or maker or designer, and that this was an elite activity rather than just a common activity. And people who've written about Omar Khayyam never really address this sort of tent maker epithet.
Should I go next or? I can go next.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So I love all the questions that you had. I tried to address a couple that I remember exactly. So first, about the importance of textiles as a medium, like in historical studies in general. At least in the field of art history, it is pretty well known that textiles have been relatively marginalized for a long time because in a sort of general compared to, for instance, like paintings or architecture as a medium. Mainly, most likely because of how the whole field of art history / Islamic art history as a subfield of art history sort of developed. We are talking about late 19th century in Vienna, and mostly in German context, mostly not just there, but which was like based on mostly Hegelian idea of like what is art. So the huge division between fine arts, what is compared to decorative arts. So fine arts, these are like basic things which pretty much everybody knows in art history. I'm just mentioning it because I thought it maybe for millers or for historians, maybe it's not super familiar, but just in general, sorry if everybody knows and I'm repeating. But that's, I would say, like definitely we still need a lot of it's great to see so many people are actually getting more and more interested in textiles in any field of study, particularly in historical aspects of textiles. So in history, in art history, both all these fields, and it's definitely a sort of really interdisciplinary field. So I would say probably that's one of the reasons why I could just definitely mention that while textiles haven't been like very at the center of like many studies, again in art history compared to like, for instance, paintings, there's a Eurocentrism of like fields. That's one. And about which is just very quick note, which is kind of ironic because many art historians, Europeans, actually sort of many theorists, and even like the field of Islamic art sort of was born based on textiles, like even in Vienna. But going back to the other thing, one of the questions that you had, if I'm not mistaken, you asked about the consumption of these fabrics. Just very quickly about, for instance, my work, I guess in my presentation and almost in the book manuscript, the project I'm working on, I'm constantly talking about textiles, but you don't see any textiles, which is like, it could be a question, where are your textiles? Like you're talking about architecture, city, these elites, like everything, but where is textile is the center of your work, which is a great question. So that's some of the things, one of the reasons why I really insist to say in my work is there are plain fabrics, plain silk, and I think it's really plays into the sort of narrative I'm trying to talk about. And they're like pretty late, like 18th, 19th century, that they should be around. So they are around, but I haven't been able to, for different reasons, practical reasons, and also like disciplinary like reasons. I'm still on my way to actually study them. But one thing I believe some scholars don't exactly agree with me on this, but many of these textiles were not actively collected compared to, let's say, 16th century like Safavid, like velvet. They were like so like exciting from the point of view of like the world, the market, art dealers and like collectors who are like collecting these things. So I'm talking about plain silk. So how exciting it would be for people, especially like late stuff, like 18th, 19th century plain silk. So if you have it on the table and you're like a rich person in the 19th century or early 20th century, compared to 16th century like velvet, like Safavid. So probably you're going with that rather than the other one. And of course, the whole art market is changing in different ways. So and I actually hope that my studies like mine would actually change, like it grabs more attention to like different types of textiles and their value, and it might actually change. So we might end up having like these more of these textiles in museums, particular art museums, but many of those are actually in ethnographic museums now. So I'm trying to reach out to them rather than quote unquote art museums. Again, I'm going back to Hegelian idea of like, what is fine art, what is decorative art. These are like, arbitrary like lines. So consumption wise, in my work, that's a chapter I didn't talk about at all in my presentation. I have one chapter to talk about the consumption part, we should, because I'm talking about mass production. So there should be, when we have mass production, probably have like mass production, like consumption somewhere, because where does it go? So that's actually short answer to that is it was mainly for the Iranian market. So it was not export, but not just the city of Kashan, but I would say like the court. And I actually, analyzed for that chapter. I analyzed paintings, late 18th to late 19th century to mid 19th century paintings to argue that I don't have the garments or the fragments yet, but paintings and later even like photos tell me that possibly these are silks people are actually wearing. And like, so in that chapter, I'm actually talking about a sort of fashion history of the time to make my point that, there was a huge consumption market for these, and sort of the relative absence of the sort of export market of like, because this is the time that, French and like, the whole like, it's a crazy time of like exportation, importation, but this is like the post-Saadi era, which is like, there's a huge gap of because of the political system is not really stable. A lot of companies, like European companies, which were like around during the Saadi era, they left and they came back like a little later. Yeah. But I think that that sort of unstable political situation in Iran, famously during the 18th century, quote unquote short 18th century, sort of created a sort of opportunity for the local production, because there was not a lot of like other like competitors who could actually really work inside the market. So long story short, I would say like local market.
Yeah. And that sort of underscores again the wonderful contribution of your work in terms of focusing on the mass production and decentering spaces that are assumed to dominate that, right? So we have about just under 15 minutes left for this panel. So I wanted to make sure we gave Patricia an opportunity if you wanted to weigh in. Can you hear me? Sorry, I forgot to take my
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And then open it up to questions from the audience, both virtual and present, or virtually present and present. Sorry.
No, so I mean, just quickly, so for production of textiles from medieval Anatolia, we know very, very little, also because not a lot has been preserved from that period, whether it be for, carpets are very fragmentary, what I showed you on the slides, and silk textiles, for instance, we know they existed, but there's very few surviving fragments, and it's really not clear how much of this was produced, for instance, within is like Muslim ruled Anatolia, how much of this was imported, for instance, from Byzantine contexts where you do have relatively similar productions. There's not really enough material, I think, to sort of figure that out. And we know more for the Ottoman productions of silk from, starting in the late 15th century, right? You have Bursa as a major center, first of silk weaving, then also of sericulture at the same time. And you have eventually in the 16th century, imperial carpet manufacturers such as Hereke, which is kind of like Islamic for tiles, sort of the imperial monopoly for these things. In terms of the place of textiles in art history, what I find very striking, particularly for my project right now, is that carpets are very well studied. So carpets from the medieval and early modern Islamic world are very well studied, often under this sort of purview of Oriental carpets, but not necessarily just that. But they're studied sort of as a category on its own, and not so much or very rarely in conjunction with the buildings that they invariably would have been in, or the spaces more broadly, because if you look at, of course, book paintings from the Timurid period and later, you very often see textiles being used in outdoor settings. That's true both for tents, but also carpets that are used in gardens and things like that. So I think, that's sort of one of the places, the sort of the hinge between textiles and architecture more broadly that needs work. That's true for fields beyond Islamic art history, and there's a number of scholars who are doing more on that. But I was really struck as I was getting into this project, like how much carpets are sort of in that corner that's very much dominated by collecting / art market since the late 19th century, and where I realized that I myself, actually being primarily an architectural historian, but having dabbled in textiles, but how little I know about carpets. And sort of, okay, fine, now I guess we'll have some readings to do here.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Do we have any questions in the chat function?
No.
Okay, Joel has a question.
Hi. I don't know if folks can hear, am I projecting loud enough that is this okay?
I can
to talk?
also,
Okay.
I can like move the hockey puck.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, my question is for Professor Bulliet. It's funny, actually. You know, my first work was on hadith commentary. So my career migration from hadith to thinking about trade actually has some strange echoes and resonances with your description, although I work on a much later period in the 15th century, and that same phenomenon of merchants and hadith transmission is still very much a really important part of the story. And you know what I found in my work, of course, that is actually how important the spice trade, the pepper trade was in generating the kind of revenue and patronage that would support the transmission of hadith and these knowledge practices. And textiles, of course, were there too. I guess one of the things I've been struck as I've gotten deeper into this work is the way in which it's not just the case that these industries like the textile trade or the spice trade are generating revenue, which then kind of indirectly support these knowledge or these knowledge practices and knowledge, these kind of traditions of knowledge, but also the way in which, in a certain sense, the knowledge, these knowledge practices and this transmission of knowledge actually shapes the industry itself and kind of returns back and not just regulates it and shapes it, but also helps imbue certain kinds of cultural meanings, religious meanings, and in a certain sense helps to form the value, their very value. And I was just struck reading your piece as well, kind of in your conclusion that you shared with everybody so generously in the Dropbox, was this idea of that these hadith collections, you couldn't imagine the production of hadith without this cotton boom or without without this textile trade. And I guess I wonder whether you could reflect or whether you have reflected on the reverse of that. In other words, could you imagine the cotton boom and the textile trade without these dense networks of hadith transmitters, these traditions of knowledge, and in what ways could you imagine? I guess could you imagine, or could you reflect on the idea? I mean, could we imagine a cotton boom and a textile boom without these traditions of knowledge?
Yeah, good question. I've been thinking a lot about certain aspects of it because it essentially is relating the sort of the high-end, cultural high-end, discourse with a low-end user, someone who's in a cotton field or in a weaving factory, totally unknown, and but they must have been there in thousands and thousands of people, and I've become increasingly speculative about whether the actual spread of Islam into new populations is highly related to extractive industries in which the people who are paying for or investing in the industry are people with religious interests, and they require or urge the people who come under their control as low-end producers, they make them become Muslims. Now, Dick Eaton's book on Islam and the Bengal frontier makes precisely this argument with respect to organized paddy rice growing in East Bengal, and I thought, well, that was a great observation. But I've since recently read there's a French master's dissertation about the growing of cotton and association with the spread of Islam in Hausa land. I can't remember the author's name, but I can recover it somehow. And I also been doing some work on the Philippines. I'm very interested there, not so much in what happens with the Muslims, but happens with the Spaniards, that as in the New World, in the Philippines, using forced labor to produce in the Philippines sugarcane was related to the Christianization, and those Filipinos who wanted to retain their non-Christian, their pre-Christian beliefs, often migrated into the hill country in order to avoid the labor requisitions of the Spaniards. And the Spaniards, of course, wanted everyone to be a Christian. So I'm beginning to think that the cotton boom in Iran is one of the reasons why Iran becomes Muslim before any other any other area outside of the core of Arabia and Iraq, and whether the people who built villages to grow cotton and then built factories to employ weavers, whether they actually had an expectation that these people would become Muslims. There's a very interesting, just little tidbit in the Chronicles that says that there's a requirement made in the sort of late Umayyad period, I believe it was, that every Muslim in Iran should know at least one surah of the Quran. Well, you can't pray unless you know one surah of the Quran, because that's what the Salat is. And the idea that you had people who were Muslims in substantial number who did not know how to pray, did not know the words. It sounds as though you had a lot of nominal growth of Islam that ultimately in the second, third generations produces Muslim families that are identifying themselves socially as Muslims. And of course you have this with Ibn Tumart going up into the mountains of Morocco, which supposedly has been a Muslim country for a long time, and lining up people to say, La, you say Allah, you say, to try and teach them some basic lore in Arabic. I think that we've had a tendency to make assumptions about places becoming Muslim, sort of full stop, without really examining what that means. I know in the southern Philippines where I've been working, the actual day-to-day practice of Islam, at least up until very recent times, was primarily centered on shamans and magicians who were writing amulets, who were protecting against the multitude of evil spirits people had, who were protecting people in warfare against being shot, and who had shamanistic practices that clearly from surviving texts go back into pre-Islamic periods and have virtually nothing to do with Islam. And that's the reason in the Malay world, you have the distinction between Sharia and Ada. And sort of Ada is everything that's non-Muslim and sort of put in a separate category of custom. But I think there is a relationship there that is much more important and unrecognized than simply people buying fibers, turning them into textiles and selling them. I mean, it's not, and the thing, who grew the spices? Yeah. And what was required of the people who were harvesting cloves or nutmegs or things like that. I just don't know of any literature on it.
So you've already answered this to some extent, and this is really a question. This is really a question for Dick and Nader. And it's, we talked about investment, right? This really came across in the paper as much as the talk for Dick, right? And you can build a qanat if you have enough money, and this is a way of settling, and so what about the weavers? Like we talked about the architecture, the investment of the elites in this modular architecture and the pit looms that fit it perfectly. What's going on? Where are the weavers? We have cotton growers. We have these names that we've talked about. What's going on in terms of, like, what do we know about the people actually doing the work? And I understand this is the problem of source as well. So I don't mean to, be obnoxious about this.
The work isn't simply the weaving. The work is also the production of fiber.
Sure.
So it's the farming. But I've wondered about this for the last 50 years. And so I'm not going to give you an answer, but there is one quarter in Nishapur that appears to be the weavers. And yet how one can take one word that shows up in a text and build a hypothesis of any substance upon that, I can't say otherwise. Weavers just go unmentioned.
And so if you want to rephrase your question, when you say what about weavers or like a larger network of like people who are participating in production, what is exactly your question? What about?
Well, sure. I mean,
what
you
do we
made
know
such a
about
good point, right, about the reinvestment
Yeah.
in Kashan, and the people who are reinvesting must have the money to reinvest.
Yeah.
But I assume they're not the people weaving.
That's my assumption as well.
Yeah, so this is curiosity.
Yeah.
Really, if the sources can tell us anything
Yeah.
about sort of the people that are coming into Kashan to staff all these new workshops, or just what? I'd love to know more. So it's an information question.
Yeah. So far I haven't been able to find any textual sources. That's super surprising, I guess. But there might be still. I'm still searching. But one thing I can tell you is, which is even not in my dissertation, so I have to actually add it somehow into my work, which is based on oral histories, which can get tricky. I mean, for my work, it might be less tricky because I'm talking about 18th, 19th century, but oral history, how far we can actually pull it back. Even like to 18th, 19th century, it can be questionable. People would say like, how do we know that this is a continuity? But the thing I heard from these old master weavers kind of really makes sense to me. So I can't really say like 100% it was happening during the 18th, 19th century that I'm writing my work. And what they told me was a sort of a very interesting social structure, which I assume that I'm not going to like talk about it that much because we have I think we have a very good example later on in Lorenzo's work, because I read his work and he's going to present. And I was like, wait a minute, like it was happening also in like Egypt, like medieval Egypt, because what he found in text, I talked to people and they said the same thing in Kashan, and I was surprised. So they told me that actually the other thing that I usually get this question a lot from people who are in architectural historians and urban historians, when I showed the map of Kashan and mapped, and people usually ask, what is the pattern? Like why there are like some parts and not. So which is connected to what I want to say is that they told me that so the whole story continued from this point, that they started sort of like telling me, okay, so after like interviews, can you help us? And I was like, how, what do you mean? And they said like, we are struggling. Economically, we are struggling, this and that. And then some of them started like talking about the past, like, oh, good old days when there was these, Muhammad or something, Allah, like in a respectful title, who was they call it Tajir Mahal, or the neighborhood's merchant. So they didn't say merchant, they said like literally neighborhood merchant. So long story short, these guys were there in this social structure, and they told me, these viewers said that in the past we were not concerned with cash. So these guys were around. I didn't need to be worried about the market, about the cash, about raw material, and like how I should sell it. these guys would come to us, give us like, like the order, cash, raw material, everything, because they were like local merchants. And
Putting out system,
pardon me?
a putting out system?
Yeah. So, and now after like this sort of quote unquote modernization, so many of the elites just left, and that part of the social structure is gone. So these guys are by their own. So they're trying to actually not only play the role of like the weavers that they used to do, or like these artisans, but also working like simultaneously as the neighborhood merchant as well. And the problem is that they don't have the cash, they don't have like the connections. Now they're trying to actually connect. It's a very sad story. They're trying to connect to the central government in Iran, like today. They say like, I wrote to Ahmadinejad, and he said like, I'm going to give you like this much of money. Can you do anything for us? I am a student. I don't know. I mean, because the whole story is that I had like a Tehrani accent. I would consider like as all from the capital city, I could understand, but it was really like a sad like moment for me. But from like after that layer, I realized that they're actually literally talking about a social structure which doesn't exist anymore. Which actually I read in your paper, so I'm really excited about that. So we know a little bit of here and there about the social structure and weavers, but I'm still trying to find textual sources. But a huge part of what I had is through actual ethnographic research, like oral histories that I'm actually trying to get into my work, which kind of like plays into the title of my paper, which was Material of Culture and Cultural Material of History and History of Material. Because the funny story is that I really started this project because I wanted to, I started with these workshops on this sort of spatiality, and I wanted to find text for them, and I couldn't. So I actually played back. So I analyzed those. I used oral histories to actually tell the history, because I was like, okay, these objects, there's like an archival work for like archival material for these that I can tell the history, right? Not really. So I went there, I couldn't find anything. I came back, I was like, so what should I do with these? And then one of the sources was actually going to the actual space, material, and oral histories.
Okay, can I just add one point?
I mean,
I have a feeling that with regard to the cotton boom in Iran, that the pre-existing existence of a silk industry meant that there were weavers who could be moved over, and the fact that that tiraz involves both silk and cotton, or silk and linen, suggests that there was a component of silk weaving from the Saadi period that may have played a role in providing at least the core of master weavers who could move into cotton weaving situations and play a role. But that's a guess. I don't have any textual evidence for it.
there are parallel cases, which might be helpful.